I have 3 pieces of fabric. They're all 3 inches tall. This one at the bottom is 30 inches long. There's a 15-inch long piece of fabric and a 7.5-inch long piece of fabric. So each one is half the length of the previous one. I'm going to start with the 30-inch long piece of fabric. This is going to be the base of my fabric that I've gathered. And before I get started, I'm going to make a hem. So I'm just folding the edge of the fabric up 1/4 of an inch, and I'll iron it. After I iron it, I'm going to fold it again to have a hem to iron and then sew along. So that's my first step. So I folded a hem 1/4 inch. If I wanted a bigger hem, I would just cut more fabric and fold a larger hem. Now I'm going to sew along this hem with just a normal stitch length. After I finish that, on the other side, the raw side of my fabric, I'm going to go in 1/4 inch and sew with the longest stitch that I can all the way down. At the top, I'll back stitch to hold the stitch in place, but I'm sewing all the way down and then I'm not going to back stitch at the bottom. That's because I'm going to use the thread and pull it to gather the fabric. I'll hold my threads as I lift the needle up here to make sure that it doesn't come unthreaded. So I've ironed all my fabric. You can see how much nicer that hem looks now. And I have the start where I backstitched and the end where I didn't. I need to take the top thread and pull and start pulling that thread. And you can see how that fabric now is gathering. So I'm going to gather this piece of fabric so that it's 15 inches long. So here's my other fabric that's 15 inches long, and I want to gather this evenly all the way across so it matches that piece of fabric. And what I can do is just pull it pretty tight all the way down where it's smaller than that piece of fabric. And then I open it up. So that's the same width now. So I'm putting my fabric right sides together, and I want to be careful. The wrong side of the hem is where it's, or the wrong side of the fabric is where it's hemmed on the inside. So I match the corners of the gathered fabric and the 15-inch piece fabric and pin it going straight down. Now I'm going to even out these gathers across the entire width of fabric, so it's not more gathered in one area than the other. And once I have it all evened out, I'll pin it all the way down. I'll take this over to my sewing machine and sew all the way down 1/4 inch in to attach these two pieces of fabric to each other. I need to make sure to change the stitch length back to the regular stitch length that I use instead of the larger one. And now I'm sewing 1/4 inch all the way down, making sure to remove the pins before the needle gets to them. I sewed the ruffle, the gathered area, to the fabric, so the 30-inch piece of fabric that I gathered to the 15-inch piece of fabric. Now I'm ironing it, so that seam is to the back of the fabric. And I could iron it on either side, but you see the seam is going straight up to the back of the fabric. Now I have an option. If I want to top stitch along there, I could stitch on top of it. I'm not going to for this purpose. Now I have to gather this fabric to be the same length as this other fabric. So this is 15 inches, this is 7.5. So I'm going to do the same thing where I sew 1/4 inch all the way down, and then I gather that fabric and sew it to this piece of fabric. I'm stitching 1/4 inch all the way down this piece of fabric. I changed my stitch length to the longest possible, and again I'm going to go forward and backward to back stitch that fabric to secure it, because I'm going to gather this piece of fabric to fit into the 7.5 inch piece. This is pinned. Now I'll sew this onto the gathered area. I want to make sure as I'm sewing that my stitch length is the normal length, not the extra long length. So I sewed this piece on just like I did the last one. I'm going to iron it down. And notice how I iron between each step. It really keeps the fabric in order and doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You can see now there's volume that's been created through the gathering. It's much larger at the bottom than the top. And to really show that, I want to sew these together. So similar to sewing a skirt, I'm going to sew right sides together and sew all the way down. Originally, I wasn't going to sew these together, so I went ahead and hemmed the ends. So now I need to take the hems out of the ends, but I'm only going to take it out about 1 inch. So then I can come back in and just sew that small area up. This is where a seam ripper would be great also. I have my scissors right by, so I'm using those. And this one I actually missed the edge of that hem all the way down, so I can fix that all at the same time. Before I sew the edges together, I'll iron the top here to hem this also. It's easier to iron right now while it's flat instead of after it's sewn in a tube. And this is roughly 1/4 inch. There's no reason I need to be precise right now for the sample, so I'm just going to eyeball it. So now I'll unfold that ironed edge and put the corners together. I'll sew from the top all the way down. And actually I'm going to start this way because I want these hems to go straight down as I'm sewing, so I don't have to be as careful about going in the opposite direction. So if I start at the corner and go all the way down, as I go I want to make sure these edges line up and the seams line up on each one of these areas. And then I'll sew all the way to the edge. I'm not going to pin my sample as I'm sewing it, but if it's easier for you to sew with things pinned together, go ahead and pin them together. So I'm opening up this seam here, or the hem that's ironed. And it's a little tricky to get going just because it's ironed to go a certain direction. And I want to flatten it out. I've ironed that seam flat open and then the hem back where it's supposed to be. I'm starting right where I stopped sewing with the hem, or where I tore out the last hem, and I'm just overlapping it slightly. then the top of my sample, I also ironed the seams flat and pressed the hem in. So I'm sewing on the inside, so my bobbin thread will be on the outside, which shouldn't be a problem if the tension is correct. But this is helpful so I can see the seam where I'm sewing and make sure I'm sewing on top of it, rather than sewing blindly, and if something is ironed off, then I miss part of the fabric. Trimming down all my thread now. So you can see how this has created volume. Folding it into a three-dimensional shape allows it to stand up on its own. So this is similar to a method used for tiered skirts. It could be used for a sleeve. You can see how you can gather and expand fabric. You could also start gathering back again too.